Hi everyone. Today I'm going to talk to you about Romanticism and Hawthorne. But before we begin with those, let's kind of review what we've been through so far this semester. So we began looking at the conquest of the Americas and how the attitudes and the beliefs that were formed when America was being formed came to shape our values as a country. We have looked at the Puritans and their religious values and how those shaped our country. Then we looked at how the age of reason shifted the focus from religious beliefs a little bit. We still have strong religious beliefs, but how we began to use logic and reason in our thought process. And then we looked at Native American literature and we looked briefly at slave narratives and how those reflected the sense of otherness that we saw from the very beginning of the conquest of the Americas. Then you went on to look at drama and you read the first American play to be performed in the Americas, The Contrast. And now we're moving on to literature that you're probably more familiar with. And we're going to start with Nathaniel Hawthorne and the concept of Romanticism. And so we'll begin with that. So some elements of Romanticism. We are now faced with a huge American frontier. There is a sense of a vast expanse, that there are no limits, that freedom abounds, and we can go wherever we want to go and do whatever we want to do. And this crosses over into our art, into the metaphysical, and into our intellectual frontiers. There's also a great sense of optimism. We have conquered British rule, and we are now independent and our own. And so we have this sense of anything can happen. And because of that, we have a sense of experimentation. We can grow, we can think, we can change, we can find out new things. And there's also more of a mingling of races because immigrants are coming in large numbers to the United States and we're expanding towards the West. There's also a growth of industrialization. There's a polarization between the North and the South. The North becomes more industrialized, while the South remains primarily agricultural. And this contributes to the differences in literature. You'll see Southern Gothic literature, which I wish we could go into, but we won't go into in that class. That's for part 2 of this course. And that Southern literature addresses more Southern concerns, where Northern literature deals with Northern concerns of industrialization and its impacts. So romantic subject matter. There's a quest for beauty, and this is non-didactic. This is not prescribed, but just a sense of pure beauty for the art of beauty and for the value of being beautiful and having beauty. And beauty is not just like what a person looks like, but beauty comes from nature, from your connection to the earth and to the world. And there's the use of the far and away and non-normal, antique and fanciful. In historical perspective, antiquarianism, antiquing or artificially aging, an interest in the past. America now has a past to reimagine. We have now come to mature to the point where we can look back to the olden days and how we once were. And there's also a kind of interest in the characterization and mood. And this is when grotesque and Gothicism, a sense of terror and a sense of fear, and the use of the odd and the queer, the unusual, starts to play in romantic subject matter. There's also a sense of escapism. We want to escape our American problems, the problems that come from industrialization, that come from an agricultural environment. There's still an interest in nature for itself, for beauty. Nature is a source of knowledge of the primitive. It's a refuge. It's a revelation of God to the individual. It's a way of us to connect to our identity as a human being, as an American. So nature is still a real integral part of our literature. And then we have human nature, and that can probably be traced back to our Puritan roots with our interest in sin and guilt and emotion. So all of these are elements of the romantic. And some romantic attitudes, which are direct responses to our age of reason, to our rationalization. And we want to appeal to the imagination, the willingness to suspend disbelief. So, in other words, to go into that land of fiction, that world of of fancy, and to set aside logic and reason. Well, that doesn't make sense because, but really to just escape. And there's a stress of emotion on emotion rather than reason. We want to, we're interested in how things feel, people's attitudes, how happy they are, and subjectivity in the form of meaning, in form and meaning. So how we see something is what makes meaning come from it. Our understanding of it, our experience of it. So these are all, again, responses to that rational logic and reason and scientific way of thinking about and looking at the world. Some techniques that you'll see in romantic literature: the remoteness of settings in time and space, improbable plots, it's not necessarily logical or reasonable, inadequate or unlikely characterization, so we don't go into fully developed characters, authorial subjectivity. So the author is going to give us his or her perspective. It's not necessarily an omniscient perspective or even a perspective that we can see as trustworthy. There can be a socially harmful morality or a world of lies. Not everything is as it seems. And there's this organic principle in writing where the form rises out from the content. We're not as formal as we once were in our writing. So compare these short stories, these short fictions, to the formality that you find in your Puritan sermons. So we're much less formal and less didactic. There's experimentation in new forms, picking up and using obsolete patterns, whether that be in language or in rhythm. And that was just, sorry, I just had that twice. So let's talk now about Hawthorne's Birthmark. You're going to be reading two pieces in this unit. The first one is Hawthorne's Birthmark. So when you're reading, look for those romantic conventions. Think about how the story reflects American society and its concerns of the time period. Think about the role of science and its impact, but also consider what the story says about human nature. And kind of, I think what you'll see in this tale is the frustration of science and human nature and how they're butting up against each other and causing conflict. So some themes that you'll see in the birthmark. You'll see love versus science. So we've got the emotional, the romantic versus the scientific, the rationality versus irrationality, nature versus science, rationality versus emotion, human nature's validity, and the boundaries of scientific inquiry. So you can see it's really an excellent example of romantic literature because it's showing that conflict between the idea of science and rationality and these more artistic kind of emotional searches. To think about when you're reading, Almer seeks to find perfection via scientific means. His flaw is his obsession with perfection, particularly as it concerns physical beauty. Much of American culture today is based upon the misconception that physical beauty validates internal beauty. Think about that with, there's so many um, conflict about inner beauty versus outer beauty. And we see that beginning with this romantic period in literature. Starting with the Enlightenment, American society develops around an emphasis on scientific reasoning, and of course, in response to the Enlightenment idea, the romantic concept of nature's role has evolved. This story pits the ideas of the Enlightenment, logic and reason, and the Romantic period, more of nature and beauty, against one another to show that a balance between science and nature has not yet been achieved, and it may be perhaps unattainable. So it may not even be possible. Another dichotomy relative to Enlightenment ideas versus Romantic concepts is rationality versus emotion. Almer rationalizes his obsession with the birthmark, whereas Georgiana reacts from emotion. The reader can sense that Hawthorne leans toward the emotional aspect. We intuit that Georgiana's position on the birthmark is the right one, whereas Almer's obsession, although rationally argued, is irrational. So you'll see this kind of battle of forces between the Enlightenment and the Romantic, between the scientific and the rational and the emotional and the unnatural play out within this story. Almer is the rational scientist. He's egotistical. He sees Georgiana's birthmark as human imperfection, a mark of sin, the fatal flaw of humanity. To Georgiana, the birthmark represents a mark of individuality. The birthmark is a metaphor for her life and her spirit. The stain goes as deep as life itself and is a bond by which angelic spirit kept its union with mortal frame. In a sense, it is Georgiana's vanity that induces her to go along with Almer's plans to rid her of the mark. She is unable to deal with Almer's opinion of the mark, so she acquiesces. She, in essence, suffers from a fatal flaw despite her inherent goodness. So think about why Georgiana goes along with Almer. Why does she allow Almer to experiment upon her? Extending the idea that the birthmark represents her spirit and her individuality, it becomes only logical that she cannot live without the birthmark. It is who she is. Thus, it is also logical to reason that the moral of the story is that science should not interfere with human nature. Imperfections and mortality are inherent in human nature and thus should be embraced and not fixed. So it brings up one of the concepts that I always like to bring up when we're talking about science and technology. And just because we have an innovation or we have the ability to do something, does that mean necessarily that we are required to do so? So just because her birthmark can be fixed, does it have to be fixed? Or is there another way of looking at Georgiana's otherness, of her difference, and accepting her for who she is? So that's kind of an introduction to Hawthorne's Birthmark. And next we're on to Melville. So if you have questions, by all means, please post them in the questions and comments forward, and I look forward to talking to you again soon.